The morning sun cast long shadows across the community garden as Mr. Chen carefully tended to his vegetable patch. At 68 years old, his movements were deliberate but graceful, each motion refined by decades of martial arts training. His weathered hands gently pulled weeds from around the tender tomato plants he'd been nurturing since early spring. The garden had become his sanctuary after retiring from teaching karate. Here, among the rows of vegetables and fragrant herbs, he found the same peace he once discovered in the dojo. He'd wake up early each morning, pack his small gardening kit, and walk the 3 blocks from his modest apartment to this green haven in downtown Atlanta. Today started like any other. Mr. Chen wore his favorite straw hat, protecting his face from the Georgia sun as he worked. The sound of birds chirping mixed with distant traffic, creating a peaceful urban symphony. He smiled, remembering how his own master had taught him that harmony could be found anywhere, even in the heart of a busy city. His peaceful morning was interrupted by loud laughter and the distinct sound of phones recording video. 3 teenagers had entered the garden, their expensive sneakers crunching on the gravel path. Mr. Chen noticed them immediately but continued his work, hoping they were just passing through. He'd seen them around the neighborhood before, usually causing trouble at the corner store or harassing other gardeners. The tallest of the 3 pointed his phone at Mr. Chen and nudged his friends. "Hey, look what we got here," he called out, his voice carrying that unmistakable tone of mockery. The other 2 snickered, positioning themselves to get better angles with their phones. Mr. Chen kept his focus on his plants, his experienced hands never faltering as he worked. He'd faced prejudice before, it was nothing new. But these were just kids, he reminded himself. Kids who needed guidance more than punishment. "Yo, old man," the second teen called out, attempting to mimic an Asian accent. "What you growing there?" "Some special kung fu vegetables." His friends burst into laughter, encouraged by their own cruelty. Mr. Chen slowly stood up, his movements fluid despite his age. He turned to face them, showing no anger or fear, just calm curiosity. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice carrying years of wisdom. "Would you like to learn about gardening? These tomatoes will be ready soon. They're perfect for sharing." His gentle response seemed to confuse them momentarily. The third teen, wearing an expensive basketball jersey, recovered first. "Nah, we don't want your weird vegetables, but maybe you can show us some of those crazy karate moves they show in the movies." He made exaggerated chopping motions with his hands, encouraging more laughter from his friends. Mr. Chen noticed something interesting in the boys' movements. Beneath the mockery, there was a trace of proper form. These weren't just random kids, at least one of them had some martial arts training. He could see it in the way the teen unconsciously shifted his weight, a habit that only comes from time spent in a dojo. "Your stance," Mr. Chen said quietly, "it needs work. Your back foot is turned too far out." He smiled kindly, watching surprise flash across the teen's face. "But your basic form shows promise. Who is your teacher?" The teens exchanged uncertain glances, their phones lowering slightly. They hadn't expected this response, and for a moment, their carefully constructed facade of superiority cracked. The peaceful garden fell silent except for the rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. Little did these young troublemakers know they had just encountered someone who would change their lives forever. But first, they would have to learn some difficult lessons about respect, humility, and the true meaning of strength. Mr. Chen watched them carefully, already planning how to turn this moment of confrontation into an opportunity for growth. The 3 teens recovered from their momentary surprise, their phones still recording. The tallest one, wearing a red snapback cap, stepped forward with renewed confidence. "Oh yeah? What do you know about karate, old man?" He kicked over a small potted plant, sending soil spilling across the garden path. Mr. Chen watched silently as years of carefully tended herbs scattered across the ground. His expression remained calm, though his eyes held a hint of sadness, not for his destroyed plants, but for the anger he saw in these young hearts. Other gardeners had started to notice the commotion. Mrs. Rodriguez from the tomato patch next door nervously gathered her tools, while Mr. Thompson from the community center watched from behind his sunflowers, phone in hand, but unsure whether to call for help. "Please," Mr. Chen said softly, "the plants have done nothing to hurt you." He bent down and began carefully scooping the scattered soil back into the overturned pot. "If you're interested in martial arts, I'd be happy to show you proper technique. The teen in the basketball jersey laughed, but it sounded forced. Look at him, trying to be all wise and stuff. He made more exaggerated karate chop motions, accidentally revealing more of his actual training. Wax on, wax off, right? Mr. Chen noticed how the third teen, wearing a local dojo's t-shirt under his jacket, hung slightly back from his friends. There was recognition in his eyes now. Something about Mr. Chen bothered him, like a half-remembered story from his training. Your dojo, Mr. Chen said, pointing to the teen's partially visible t-shirt. Golden Dragon Academy, yes? Master Wong's school. He smiled as the teen's eyes widened. The front stance they teach there, show me. The teen automatically dropped into the stance before he could stop himself, muscle memory taking over. His friends turned to stare at him in confusion. Yo, what are you doing? The tall one demanded. Don't listen to this guy. But Mr. Chen was already moving, his movements fluid as water. See here, he demonstrated, his own stance perfect despite his age. Your weight distribution is off. It comes from years of incorrect practice. Let me show you. The teen in the dojo shirt found himself following along automatically, adjusting his stance as Mr. Chen guided him. For a moment, the mockery was forgotten as genuine instruction took place. His friends, uncomfortable with this turn of events, decided to escalate. The one in the red cap reached for Mr. Chen's water barrel intended for the garden. Let's see how your plant's like a little flood. Mr. Chen moved without seeming to move at all. One moment, the teen was pushing the barrel. The next he was stumbling backward into his friends, all three of them nearly falling. The barrel hadn't budged an inch. How did you? The teen in the dojo shirt started to ask, then stopped as realization dawned in his eyes. Stories from his instructor, photographs on the dojo wall, legendary tales of a master who had trained champions decades ago, it all started clicking into place. The morning sun caught the edge of Mr. Chen's worn gardening shirt as he shifted position, revealing just a hint of a faded dragon tattoo on his forearm. The teen in the dojo shirt grabbed his friend's arm, trying to pull him back. Guys, wait, I think I know who this is. But his friends, embarrassed and angry at being made to look foolish, weren't listening. They spread out, surrounding Mr. Chen among the garden beds. The old master simply smiled, brushed some dirt from his pants, and waited. Sometimes the hardest lessons had to be learned the hard way. The morning air grew thick with tension as the three teens faced Mr. Chen in the community garden. The teen in the dojo shirt kept trying to get his friend's attention, his voice urgent but hushed. Guys, seriously, look at his arm, that dragon tattoo. My instructor has a photo of him in the dojo. But his friends weren't listening. The tall one in the red cap circled to Mr. Chen's left, while the one in the basketball jersey moved right. They thought they had the advantage, but Mr. Chen simply stood there, peaceful as the morning itself, hands clasped behind his back. Young men, Mr. Chen said quietly, I notice you all carry yourselves like fighters. Even when you mock, your bodies remember training. He shifted his weight slightly, and somehow this tiny movement made all three teens take an involuntary step back. But you've learned only the surface of martial arts, missing its heart entirely. The teen in the dojo shirt couldn't take his eyes off Mr. Chen's forearm, where the dragon tattoo was now fully visible in the morning light. He'd seen that same dragon 100 times at his dojo, on an old black and white photograph of a legendary master who'd trained champions across Asia and America. The same master who'd taught his own instructor decades ago. That stance you're using, Mr. Chen continued, addressing the tall teen, it leaves you vulnerable here. He gestured to the teen's forward leg. And your friend's guard is too high. These are basic mistakes that could be easily corrected with proper guidance. The teen in the basketball jersey snorted, trying to mask his growing uncertainty with bravado. Oh yeah? Why don't you show us then, old man? He threw a mock punch in the air, but even this playful gesture revealed years of training. Your punch shows promise, Mr. Chen said, but your elbow drops. May I? He held out his hand, offering to demonstrate. The teen hesitated, caught between his desire to maintain his tough image and his instinctive respect for clearly superior skill. The teen in the dojo shirt finally found his voice. That's Master Chen, he blurted out. He's the White Crane Grandmaster. There's a whole wall about him at Golden Dragon. He trained Master Wong 30 years ago. His friends' expressions shifted from mockery to confusion, then to dawning realization. They'd heard the stories too. Everyone who trained in martial arts in Atlanta knew about the legendary Master Chen, who turned down offers to train celebrities and professional fighters, choosing instead to teach disadvantaged kids for free. But the tall one stammered, his tough guy act crumbling, "You're just a gardener. We've seen you here every morning with your plants and stuff." Mr. Chen smiled, gesturing to his beloved garden. "In both martial arts and gardening, we learn patience. We nurture growth. We respect the balance of nature." He plucked a leaf from one of his tomato plants. "See how the plant grows strong by bending with the wind, not fighting against it. There are lessons here, if you're willing to learn them." The teen in the basketball jersey lowered his phone, which had been recording this whole time. "So you're really him? The one who trained all those champions?" "I am simply a gardener who knows a little about martial arts," Mr. Chen replied humbly. "But if you're interested in learning properly," he demonstrated a basic form, his movements so precise and flowing that all three teens found themselves watching in awe. Even the birds seemed to fall silent. The teen in the dojo shirt bowed automatically, muscle memory from years of training kicking in. After a moment's hesitation, his friends awkwardly followed suit. Their earlier mockery felt distant now, replaced by a mix of embarrassment and genuine curiosity. Mr. Chen smiled warmly. "Now, would you like to learn how to throw a proper punch? Or would you prefer to start with helping me replant these herbs you knocked over? Both lessons are equally valuable." The teens exchanged glances, standing at a crossroads between continuing their path of disrespect or accepting this unexpected opportunity for growth. The garden around them waited in silent witness to this moment of transformation. The teens' pride wouldn't let them back down completely, not just yet. The tall one in the red cap stepped forward, trying to save face. "How about you show us some real moves first?" He reached for the water barrel again, this time with more force, determined to prove he wasn't intimidated. What happened next seemed to defy physics. Mr. Chen barely appeared to move, yet somehow the teen's own momentum sent him stumbling backward. The barrel remained perfectly still, but the teen found himself sitting on the ground, unhurt but thoroughly confused. "You see," Mr. Chen said calmly, offering a hand to help him up, "force isn't about strength alone. It's about balance, timing, and wisdom." The teen hesitated, then accepted the help, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. The one in the basketball jersey decided to try his luck. That was just a trick. He stepped forward aggressively, but his trained movements betrayed him again. Mr. Chen simply shifted slightly, and the teen's own forward motion caused him to stumble past the old master. "Your technique shows promise," Mr. Chen commented, steadying the teen before he could fall. "But you're fighting yourself more than anyone else. Watch." He demonstrated the same movement the teen had attempted, but with perfect form. "See how the energy flows, like water in a stream." The teen in the dojo shirt couldn't contain himself anymore. "That's the white crane style. Master Wong shows us videos of it, but I've never seen it done in person." His excitement overcame his attempt to maintain a tough image. Mr. Chen nodded approvingly. "Your instructor knows these forms well, but knowing is different from understanding." He gestured to a clear space between the garden beds. "Would you like to learn why your current stance isn't working?" Pride and curiosity warred on the teens' faces. The one in the basketball jersey tried one more time to take control of the situation, throwing a quick punch that he'd learned in his first year of training. Mr. Chen's response was beautiful in its simplicity. A slight turn, a gentle redirect, and the teen found himself hitting nothing but air. "Your anger makes your movements predictable," Mr. Chen explained, not unkindly. "True strength comes from peace within." He demonstrated the proper form again, moving with the grace of flowing water. "Try it this way." Almost despite themselves, the teens found themselves mimicking his movements. The one in the dojo shirt quickly discovered his front stance was indeed incorrect, while his friends began to understand just how much they had to learn. Mr. Chen moved among them, making small corrections to their forms. "Elbow higher here. Weight on the back foot there. Breathe naturally." His instructions were clear and patient, each word backed by decades of experience. Other gardeners who had been watching nervously now relaxed, some even smiling at the unexpected turn of events. Mrs. Rodriguez returned to her tomatoes, shaking her head in amazement at how the confrontation had transformed into an impromptu martial arts lesson. "Remember," Mr. Chen said, demonstrating another basic move, "martial arts isn't about fighting. It's about finding harmony with your opponent, with yourself, with the world around you." He gestured to his garden. "Just like these plants, we must be both strong and flexible, able to bend without breaking." The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the garden. The teens' phones, which had been recording everything for social media mockery, were now forgotten in their pockets. Instead, they found themselves fully absorbed in learning proper stances and forms from a master they'd initially came to ridicule. The teen in the red cap, who had started all this trouble, found himself especially drawn to Mr. Chen's teachings. His natural athletic ability, freed from the burden of showing off, began to shine through in his movements. "Could you show us that first move again?" he'd asked, his earlier hostility replaced by genuine interest. As the morning progressed, more people gathered around the garden's edges, drawn by the unusual sight. The three teens who had arrived looking for trouble were now fully absorbed in their impromptu lesson with Mr. Chen. Their phones lay forgotten on a nearby bench, recording nothing but the peaceful sounds of birds and distant traffic. The teen in the dojo shirt couldn't stop staring at Mr. Chen's dragon tattoo, visible whenever the old master demonstrated a move. Finally, he gathered his courage to ask, "Sir, is it true you trained champions in Hong Kong before coming to America?" Mr. Chen smiled gently as he corrected another stance. "Those are old stories. What matters is the present moment, and right now, your back foot needs to turn slightly inward." But the teen persisted, his excitement breaking through his earlier attitude. "My instructor has this huge photo in our dojo. It shows you with the Chinese national team from the 80s. He said you were the youngest master to ever." He trailed off as Mr. Chen raised a hand. "Your instructor speaks too kindly of an old man who now prefers to grow tomatoes," Mr. Chen replied. But there was a twinkle in his eye as he demonstrated another form, this one more complex. His movements were so precise, so perfectly balanced, that even the other gardeners stopped to watch in amazement. The teen in the basketball jersey whistled softly. "That's some next-level stuff right there. Nothing like what they teach us at the recreation center." Mr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Because you learn techniques, but not principles. Watch closely." He picked up a fallen leaf, holding it delicately. "See how the leaf bends but doesn't break? True strength is like this, flexible yet unbreakable." The tall teen in the red cap, who had started all this trouble, stepped forward. "Could you show us that thing you did earlier? When you made me fall without touching me?" "Ah," Mr. Chen smiled, "but I didn't make you fall. You did that yourself. In martial arts, we learn to use our opponent's energy. Like this." He demonstrated the movement again, slower this time, showing how it redirected force rather than opposing it. As the teens practiced this new concept, other young people from the neighborhood began to gather. Word had spread quickly. The legendary Master Chen, whose photo hung in dojos across Atlanta, was giving an impromptu lesson in the community garden. "Your instructor," Mr. Chen said to the teen in the dojo shirt, "he was once like you. Full of fire, thinking strength meant dominance. Now he teaches others the true way." He paused, watching the teen process this information. "Perhaps one day you will do the same." The morning sun had risen high now, casting shorter shadows across the garden beds. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a tray of lemonade, and Mr. Thompson from the community center brought out some folding chairs for the growing audience. The three teens who had arrived as troublemakers were now showing others what they'd learned, their previous arrogance replaced by genuine enthusiasm for sharing knowledge. They moved differently now, not just physically, but in their whole demeanor. "Master Chen," the tall teen said suddenly, looking ashamed, "about your plants earlier, we're really sorry." He glanced at the overturned pot they'd kicked at the start of all this. Mr. Chen nodded toward his garden tools. "Then let us practice another important lesson, how to make right what we have made wrong." He handed them gardening gloves. "In martial arts, as in life, we must take responsibility for our actions." The teens worked alongside Mr. Chen, carefully replanting the herbs they destroyed earlier. Their movements were different now, more mindful, more purposeful. The tall one in the red cap found himself fascinated by how Mr. Chen handled each plant with the same precise control he showed in his martial arts. Gardening and martial arts share many principles, Mr. Chen explained as they worked. Both require patience, respect for nature, and understanding of balance. He demonstrated how to pack the soil properly around a young basil plant. Too much force crushes the roots, too little, and the plant cannot stand strong. The gathered crowd had grown, with people from all over the neighborhood watching this unexpected transformation. Some had brought out chairs, others sat on the garden's edge, all captivated by the scene unfolding before them. Now, Mr. Chen said, standing up and brushing the soil from his hands, "Let's see what you've learned about balance." He moved to a clear patch of ground between the garden beds. "Attack me, but remember what we practiced about control." The teen in the basketball jersey stepped forward first. His punch was different now, more focused, less wild. Mr. Chen simply wasn't there when the punch arrived, having moved just enough to let the force pass harmlessly by. "Better," Mr. Chen praised. "You're thinking before moving now, but watch your center of gravity." He demonstrated the correct positioning. Your power comes from the ground up, like a tree drawing strength through its roots. The teen in the dojo shirt tried next, attempting a more complex combination he'd learned at his school. Mr. Chen's response was like watching water flow around rocks, effortless, natural, perfect. Each of the teen's strikes met empty air, while he found himself constantly adjusting just to keep his balance. "You see," Mr. Chen said to the watching crowd, "he attacks with skill, but skill without wisdom is like a garden without water." He helped the teen regain his stance. "Show me again, but this time, feel the movement rather than forcing it." As the morning wore on, more young people from the neighborhood joined in the lesson. Mr. Chen taught them basic stances and simple movements, always connecting the principles back to nature and the garden around them. "Look at this tomato plant," he said, guiding the tall teen's hand to a sturdy stem. "Feel how it bends without breaking. That is the strength we seek in martial arts. Not the strength of a wall, but the strength of a reed in the wind." The teen in the red cap, who had started the day with mockery and destruction, now found himself completely absorbed in learning. His natural athletic ability, freed from the burden of showing off, began to shine through in his movements. "Your body understands," Mr. Chen told him, "even if your mind still doubts. This is why we practice, to bring body and mind into harmony." He demonstrated another movement, this one showing how to redirect an opponent's energy. Like the river flowing around the stone, we do not fight against force, we guide it. The other teens watched in amazement as their friend, who usually led them in causing trouble, executed the move almost perfectly. Mr. Chen nodded approvingly. "You have good instincts. Now you must learn to use them wisely." Even Mrs. Rodriguez, who had initially fled from the confrontation, now sat watching with a proud smile, her garden gloves still on her hands. She saw what everyone else could see. These weren't the same angry young men who had entered the garden that morning. "Remember," Mr. Chen said, gathering them all together, "what you learn here is not for fighting. It is for growing, like these plants, like this garden, like your own understanding." He looked each teen in the eye. "Will you remember this?" 1 week later, the community garden looked different. New plants filled the beds, the plants were freshly weeded, and there was a small crowd gathered around Mr. Chen's plot. The 3 teens who had once come to cause trouble were now regular visitors, arriving early each morning to help with the gardening before their martial arts practice. The tall one in the red cap had traded his flashy sneakers for practical work boots, kneeling in the soil as he carefully planted seedlings under Mr. Chen's guidance. "Like this?" he asked, gently packing the earth around a young pepper plant. "Perfect," Mr. Chen nodded. "You see how the plant responds to gentle hands? Just like in our practice, power controlled by wisdom." He smiled as the teens' friends arrived, each carrying watering cans and garden tools. The teen in the basketball jersey had deleted the mocking videos from that first day. Instead, his phone now held recordings of Mr. Chen's lessons, both in gardening and martial arts. He'd watch them at night, practicing his forms in his backyard, understanding more each day about true strength. "Master Chen," called the teen in the dojo shirt, arriving with his regular instructor in tow. "Look who came to visit." The instructor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, bowed deeply to Mr. Chen. My old student, Mr. Chen, greeted him warmly. Come to check on your students' progress. He gestured to the teens, who were now demonstrating their improved forms to the gathering crowd. The instructor watched in amazement as his former troublemakers moved with new grace and purpose. The change in them, it's remarkable, he said softly. We've tried for years to teach them discipline, but... Sometimes, Mr. Chen replied, the lessons must come from unexpected places. He picked a ripe tomato and offered it to his former student. Like this garden, we plant seeds, but we cannot force them to grow. We can only provide the right conditions and wait patiently. The community had noticed the change too. Where once people hurried past groups of teens, they now stopped to watch the morning practice sessions. Children would gather to help with the watering, learning about plants and gentle strength from both Mr. Chen and his new students. The teen in the red cap, once the leader in mischief, had become the most dedicated student. The garden taught me patience, he explained to a young boy watching him practice. You can't rush a plant to grow, and you can't rush learning either. Master Chen showed us that. Even the local community center had taken notice. They'd offered Mr. Chen a space to teach formal classes, but he preferred his garden. The best lessons, he would say, come from nature itself. So instead, they helped expand the garden, adding more beds and benches for the growing number of visitors. Mrs. Rodriguez, tending her tomatoes next door, smiled at the transformation. Those boys, she said to another gardener, they came to destroy, but instead, they learned to create. That's the real magic of this place. The teens had started their own little garden plots now, growing vegetables they'd once mocked. They learned that the discipline of martial arts flowed naturally into the patience of gardening, and both taught them about respect, for themselves, for others, and for the world around them. Remember that first morning? The teen in the basketball jersey asked his friends as they'd practiced their forms among the garden beds. We thought we were so tough. Now we know what real strength is, replied the tall one, carefully adjusting his stance the way Mr. Chen had taught them. It's not about showing off or putting others down. Mr. Chen watched his students with quiet pride. They weren't just learning martial arts or gardening. They were growing into something new, something better. Like his plants reaching toward the sun, they were transforming one day at a time. The garden will always be here, Mr. Chen told them, and so will these lessons. Now, who's ready to learn about pruning techniques? In both plants and martial arts, knowing what to cut away is just as important as knowing what to keep.